Heidi, Heidi, where are you? Come on over so I can review one of your many movies. Caution! The following video is an in-depth review of the movie I'm currently reviewing, which means that there will be massive spoilers in the review. If you haven't seen this movie yet, then please feel free to watch this movie first before watching this video. However, if you have already seen this movie, or you just want to know my thoughts on this movie, then keep watching. This video was requested to me by Newwaytoofeelthepain, and if you want me to review a movie for the Reviews 2.0 series, then please feel free to suggest a movie in the comments down below. Who would have thought that Hanna-Barbera, the same company that was responsible for memorable cartoons like Yogi Bear, the Flintstones, the Jetsons, and Scooby-Doo, would try their hand at adapting the famous children's novel, Heidi? There were so many Heidi movies being released during the 1970s and the 1980s that I just couldn't keep track of all of them. Despite the fact that I heard so much about the character of Heidi when I was little, I never actually watched a movie that starred Heidi. Maybe it was because I just wasn't that interested in the character at the time, despite the fact that Heidi was such a well-beloved children's story. It wasn't until Newwaytoofeelthepain had made a request for me to review the movie HEIDI'S SONG. Now, I had never heard of this movie before, and when I first got this request, I was like, okay, I'd never even heard of this movie's existence, but I'm willing to give it a try. And I actually thought that I would never be able to watch this movie because it wasn't as readily available as most movies that I had seen so far. So when I finally sat down and watched this film, I was quite surprised that I ended up really enjoying it, despite the fact that I know next to nothing about the character of Heidi. So I guess you could say that this film was my first exposure to the character of Heidi. But before I get into what I like to hate about this film, I would like to give out a brief summary of this film. The film starts off with a young girl named Heidi who is taken to her grandfather's home by her aunt Data so that she could live with him. At first, Heidi's grandfather didn't want to take care of Heidi since he was so used to being alone, and he didn't like the way that Heidi kept changing things around his house. But when Heidi's grandfather ended up getting a leg injury when he tried to save Heidi from a fallen tree, he and Heidi started to bond with each other, and it was then that Heidi's grandfather wanted Heidi to stay with him. But unfortunately, after Heidi's grandfather's injury healed, Heidi's aunt comes back and tells Heidi that she has to leave her grandfather because Heidi will be living with a rich family in Frankfurt, Germany. As I mentioned before, I had never read the original book of Heidi, or even watched any of the movies and TV shows that featured the character of Heidi. So imagine my surprise and delight when I finally got the chance to watch a movie that featured the character of Heidi. I was actually surprised that Hanna-Barbera had worked on this movie because at the time that this movie came out, they were usually known for making humorous cartoons like Scooby-Doo and Yogi Bear. But this movie was much different from what Hanna-Barbera was producing at the time because it was much more story-driven and the animation was much more realistic than what we normally expected from Hanna-Barbera. Heck, there were a few times where I forgot that Hanna-Barbera had worked on this film because this movie was much more serious in tone than what Hanna-Barbera had done before. The only other Hanna-Barbera project that came close to this movie's level was Charlotte's Web, and that movie came out a full decade before this movie came out. This was actually a good thing because it showed me that Hanna-Barbera is capable of making serious animation. It was especially apparent in some of their later projects like The Pirates of Dark Water and SWAT Cats. So regarding the movie, I was pleasantly surprised that this movie had tackled some mature themes like child separation and the importance of friendship. This movie deals with the issue of child separation rather frequently as the main character Heidi is always constantly being moved from one home to another. And you can see how this would upset her, especially when she is starting to get used to her new home. Even though I never really moved from my home when I was little, I can sympathize with Heidi's plight in moving from one home to another. First, Heidi had to move away from her aunt to live with her grandfather. Then she became very close to her grandfather and wanted to live with him. And then her aunt comes back and tells Heidi that she has to move away from her grandfather to live with a wealthy family that she doesn't even know. This is especially tragic for Heidi's grandfather, as he was starting to care about Heidi. And when Heidi is forced to move away from him, he goes back to his grumpy and lonely self that he was at the start of the movie. Moving away from a loving home or a loving family can be very tough for anyone. It's even tougher when you're trying to get used to a new environment after being so used to your old environment. I also love the way that this film tackles the theme of friendship. Like Charlotte's Web, this film shows how the power of friendship has helped the main protagonist conquer any sort of problems that come their way. In this film, Heidi had to go through a lot of traumatic moments to get the happy ending that she wanted, such as constantly moving away from the people that she cares about and having to deal with a vicious gang of rats towards the end of the film. But once Heidi meets the ill girl named Clara in Germany, Heidi starts becoming more optimistic as the film progresses. And she was even willing to help Clara get out of her home in order to explore the outside world. Heidi's friendship had a positive influence on Clara, as Heidi helped Clara explore the things that she wasn't able to explore due to her sickness. And I especially love to see where Heidi went and got Clara some kittens to have as pets, because that was what Clara had always wanted. This shows just how close Heidi and Clara are to each other, and how they were both willing to protect each other from any harm. So now that I talked about some of the themes in this movie, I would like to talk about the characters themselves. The first character that I wanted to talk about is none other than Heidi herself. Heidi is shown as being an optimistic and friendly young girl who is always looking on the positive side of things, despite how bleak the situations can get. I like the fact that Heidi has always remained positive throughout the film, because it's rare that I get to see a character who is always friendly and yet has some depth to their character. Even though Heidi is shown as being friendly towards everyone she meets, she does have moments where she gets upset at the situations that she is thrown into. When Heidi was forced to move away from her grandfather to live with Clara, she was genuinely upset about this, since she had just started the bond with her grandfather. And when Heidi finally arrived in the city, while she became friends with Clara, she still had to go through a lot of hardship while in Germany. This was mostly because Heidi had to deal with the evil Fräulein Rottenheimer and her second-in-command Sebastian. And they both tried to make Heidi's life miserable by constantly calling her a nothing, while preventing Clara from doing anything. But despite all this, Heidi tries to make the best of a horrible situation. I also like the fact that Heidi is able to become friends with absolutely anyone she meets, and is able to bring out the best out of people. When Heidi spent some time with her grandfather, she made her grandfather to a much kinder person. When she met up with the young boy Peter, who worked for her grandfather, she helped Peter become much more optimistic and less cynical about life. And with Clara, she helped her explore the outside world, which Clara couldn't do at first due to her illness. Another character that I wanted to talk about is Clara herself. Clara was an interesting character, as she was introduced in the second half of the film, and is the wealthy person that Heidi is supposed to stay with. I really like Clara because when Heidi first got to Germany, she was the first person who treated Heidi with kindness and wanted to be her friend. I especially love her friendship with Heidi, as Clara is nothing but kind towards Heidi, and Heidi tries to do everything she can to make Clara happy. It just shows how strong their friendship with each other is. The next character that I wanted to talk about is Heidi's grandfather, and yes, he only goes by the name Grandfather. We don't even know what his real name is. Heidi's grandfather probably goes through the most character development in the entire movie, as he started off as a grumpy old man who doesn't want to be with anybody. But the moment that Heidi came into his life, he starts becoming a much kinder person, and he even wanted Heidi to live with him. I found Heidi's grandfather to be the most interesting character in the entire film because he is such a complex character. He's one of the few characters in the film who has a gruff personality for the most part, but can be quite caring, especially towards Heidi once you get to know him. I do like the moment shared between Heidi and her grandfather. I like the fact that Heidi and her grandfather's relationship was developed in a natural way. Heidi's grandfather didn't automatically like Heidi when she first came to his house. It was only when Heidi's grandfather had a leg injury that he and Heidi started bonding with each other due to Heidi's taking care of him while he was busy recovering from his injury. It was then that Heidi's grandfather saw how kind Heidi is, and he started treating her like the granddaughter that he never had. So when Aunt Data came in and took Heidi away to live in the big city, I actually felt really bad for Heidi's grandfather, because he had bonded with Heidi only to have her snatch away from him just as he was willing to let Heidi live with him. Which is why that I was so happy at the end that Heidi was able to reunite with her grandfather and can now finally live with him. And now I'd like to talk a bit about Peter, the young boy that works for Heidi's grandfather. There's not much to say about Peter since he doesn't show up in the film that much, but I thought that Peter was a pretty interesting foil to Heidi in the film. Heidi is shown as being a friendly and positive character, and she is the only one who can see the inner goodness in her grandfather's heart. Peter, meanwhile, was a much more cynical character and was a bit annoyed at Heidi's friendly personality. Heidi and Peter also have different relationships with Heidi's grandfather. Heidi is always friendly towards her grandfather, and her grandfather is often kind towards Heidi. Peter, meanwhile, always viewed Heidi's grandfather as a grouchy old man, and yes, Heidi's grandfather has treated Peter rather roughly, although to be fair, he treated Peter roughly before Heidi came in, and once Heidi softens his heart, Heidi's grandfather did start to treat Peter a bit better. I also like the fact that Heidi and Peter soon became friends once they got to know each other. Probably the scene that best showcased Heidi and Peter's friendship was the scene where Heidi was in danger of being killed by a bunch of rats, and Peter immediately rushes towards the city and comes to Heidi's aid. Now, I will admit that I did find it weird that Peter and the animals were able to track Heidi down, despite the fact that the city is a huge place. I mean, how in the world did Peter and the animals know exactly what building Heidi was trapped in? Heidi could have been in any one of those buildings, and they wouldn't have known which building to go to. I guess you could chalk it up to that little baby owl telling Peter where Heidi was, although I do wonder how Peter is able to understand a baby owl. I know I'm not supposed to think too hard on things like humans talking to animals or people finding the location of a place that they have no knowledge of whatsoever, but once again, I can't help myself. My curious mind has got to know the answers to these things. And the last set of characters that I wanted to talk about are the main antagonists themselves, Fräulein Rottenheimer and the butler Sebastian. They are shown as Clara's caretakers, and they mostly spent the movie keeping Clara locked up inside her home and not allowing her to do the things that she wanted. I will admit that they are not the most memorable villains that I have ever seen in any animated film, but I did find some of their actions in the film to be pretty vicious. Probably the worst thing that they have done in the film was treat Heidi like a lesser being and constantly calling her a nothing. They even went as far as to locking Heidi down in the cellar with a bunch of murderous rats just because Heidi was trying to do things to make Clara happy. I honestly don't know their true motives into all this or why they are so determined to make Clara miserable, but they do bring in an air of menace to the story as they are the obstacles that Heidi has to face. Probably the best part about this movie was the animation itself. I had mentioned before that there were times where I had forgotten that this was a Hanna-Barbera produced film, because the animation was much more fluid here compared to what we normally saw with Hanna-Barbera. The only way that I knew that this was a Hanna-Barbera production was due to the music that was normally being used in Hanna-Barbera's cartoons from the 1970s through the early 1980s. The animation in this film was just so amazing, as the characters moved so fluidly, and I especially loved the facial expressions of most of the characters, especially with the villains and Heidi's grandfather. Another fantastic aspect of this film were the song sequences themselves. I absolutely love most of the songs in this movie, with my favorite songs being Imagine, That's What Friends Are For, and especially Ode to a Rat. The song sequences are probably the strangest moments in the film, as they use weird animations for these sequences. Like, for example, there was a sequence where Heidi had a nightmare where she was dancing with a bunch of goblins, and then a mountain suddenly turns into a monster and tried to grab her. I found that sequence to be the most bizarre and nightmarish out of the entire movie, and it is definitely a sequence that would stay with me for a while. The other song sequence that used nightmarish and weird animations was the villain song She's a Nothing, with both Fräulein Rottenheimer and Sebastian both transform into vicious monsters when they are belittling Heidi. But the song that I really wanted to talk about is Ode to a Rat. Now, don't get me wrong, I really enjoyed this song, as Sammy Davis Jr. did a fantastic job of singing this song, but I always felt that this song was a little too out of place in this film. Since the song is done in a jazzy number, which contrasts strongly with the movie's orchestral soundtrack, when I first heard this song, I was like, what? Why is a song like this in this movie? It's like Hanna-Barbera was saying, oh great, we got Sammy Davis Jr. singing a song for one of our movies. It doesn't matter if that particular song fits the tone of the movie or not. But despite all that, I still found this song to be quite enjoyable. Now that I talked about the things that I liked about this film, I would like to talk about some of the issues that I have with this film. Probably the main problem that I had with this film was that most of the characters weren't that well developed. It felt like the movie was trying to cram in so many characters that they didn't have enough time to develop each of them properly. Many of the characters' backstories weren't fleshed out well, and I would have loved to know more about these characters. Like, for example, we don't know much about Heidi's grandfather. Why did he become such a grouch? Was it because he was alone for so many years that he didn't know how to express his emotions properly? Or was there some kind of tragedy that happened in his life that caused him to become grumpy? The movie never really explained any of this. And what about Clara? What kind of illness does Clara have that keeps her wheelchair bound, and when did she get sick? The only character that I felt that had any character development was Heidi herself. We know that both of her parents had died, and because of this, she is constantly moving from one guardian to the next. I felt that if the film was a few minutes longer and actually featured more scenes with Heidi's grandfather and Peter and explained more about Clara and her family, I would have been even more invested in the characters. Heidi's song is rated G. There are a couple of nightmarish scenes, like Heidi's nightmare sequence that involves goblins in a monstrous mountain, and the climax where Heidi's attacked by a room full of rats is pretty intense. But other than those scenes, this movie is pretty tame for the most part. Overall, I give Heidi's Song a score of an 8.6 out of 10. Even though the characters could have been developed a bit better, I really enjoyed the uniqueness of this film. This was probably one of Hanna-Barbera's best animated films, as the animation was surprisingly fluid and beautiful. I also love the relationships between the characters, especially between Heidi and her grandfather, and Heidi and Clara, and the songs were one of the most memorable things about this movie. It's such a shame that this movie is not as well known as Hanna-Barbera's other works, especially since the animation was beyond amazing. But if you are either a fan of Heidi or a fan of Hanna-Barbera in general, then you would definitely enjoy this movie. Hope you enjoyed my review of Heidi's Song.
Now it's time for... So if you liked Heidi's Song, then I would definitely recommend Charlotte's Web. It's another Hanna-Barbera produced film that also involves the main protagonist moving away to a new home and making new friends at their new home. If you like another animated film that featured the protagonist being mistreated by a person of a higher position, then I would highly recommend Disney's The Hunchback of Notre Dame. It involves the ugly yet kind-hearted Quasimodo being mistreated by his guardian, who also happens to be a high-ranking official, Frollo. And if you like another animated musical film that features a female protagonist, then I recommend Don Bluth's Thumbelina. Psst. Hey you, have you been enjoying the Reviews 2.0 videos? Want to get an added bonus for viewing these videos? Like getting early access to these videos before they are released on YouTube? Or being able to request what movies and TV shows I should review next? Then please feel free to support these videos through my Patreon account. Check out all of the tier titles on my account and choose which tier title you want to be known as. You could become a new member on the block, an early bird, be a part of the future Bunch team, a backstage passenger, an animation superstar, and last but not least, the honorary supreme. So show off your tier attire name to the world once you support the Reviews 2.0 videos through Patreon.